Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and we're going to be discussing Hannah Arendt's essay, Crisis in Education, today. Um, this essay was originally written in German and, interestingly enough, not translated by Hannah Arendt herself. And there are one or two translation issues that may or may not come up as we go through the text. It's in the book, Between Past and Future, which, as many of you know at this point, Hannah Arendt often would say was her favorite book that she wrote. It's certainly one of my favorite of her books to teach, and that's for a number of reasons. But one is that it comes out of this incredibly fertile period in her life in the early to mid 1950s, after she's published The Origins of Totalitarianism, and she's working on a series of new books, one on Marx, one on totalitarianism, and eventually drops those projects and writes The Human Condition. And these essays are all written in that period, or either slightly before it or slightly after it. And it really is the time in which she comes into her own as a thinker, and is thinking both on a very abstract level, as in The Human Condition, but also around issues. And The Crisis in Education is an essay that Hannah Arendt wrote in the 1950s. She wrote it in German. The English translation is at times a bit problematic. And it's an essay that is deeply connected to her companion essay, or to the larger essay, What is Authority? And I thought it would be helpful to return to the What is Authority essay at the beginning and just remember what she says in that essay, both about authority and specifically about education. So if you turn back to the first page of the What is Authority essay in your book, if you have it, which is on page 91, at least in the edition that we're using, recall that she says that authority is actually something that has vanished from the modern world, and that it is, in its essence, something that is an authentic and undisputable experience that is common to all. And at the very bottom of page 91, the first page of the What is Authority essay, she begins a paragraph and she says, the most significant symptom of the crisis, namely the crisis of authority, indicating its depth and seriousness, is that it has spread to such pre-political areas as child rearing and education, where authority in the wider sense has always been accepted as a natural necessity, obviously required as much by natural needs, the helplessness of the child, as by the political necessity, the continuity of an established civilization, which can be assured only if those who are newcomers by birth are guided through a pre-established world into which they are born as strangers. And so what you see here is that the problem of authority, right, which is a political problem, and it's the loss of unquestioned authority in the public realm, has for her spread into even the pre-political realm. And we could add to this the realm of college education, which relates to this, but also the realms of science, or law, or journalism, which for her are pre-political or non-political realms, and yet depend upon authority, which has increasingly been lost. In any case, as she presents it here, there's a natural necessity for authority, in that you have a young child that needs to be helped and guided. And there's the political necessity, which is that in order to have a political world, an established civilization, that requires that those who are born into it are educated, acculturated into that world, into a pre-established world into which they are born as strangers. And so this connection between the What is Authority essay and the Crisis in Education essay are clear. And yet there's a lot to be added in the crisis in education essay. The first part, it's in 4 parts, really is focused on America, the United States. And she's looking at why it is that this crisis in education, which is an expression of the crisis of authority, happens in America. And she says there's 2 reasons at least. One is that in America we have this idea of the melting pot, where people come into the country and need to learn not only English, but also learn what it means to be American. And then the second, she thinks even more important reason, is that America has traditionally been understood as what she calls the novus ordo secularum, this desire to create a world without poverty and oppression. And I'll just point out here that the word, very unfortunate translation, the first time it says on page 172, the doing away with poverty and oppression. The second time, the abolish poverty and slavery. The word in German in both cases is Knechtschaft, which is like oppression, not slavery. And it would be silly to say that the United States was formed as a republic that planned to abolish slavery. And so she didn't actually write that. In any case, the idea here is that education is, in the United States, seen as a means towards the creation of this new world without poverty and oppression, a kind of utopian world. And that this is dangerous for her because the use of education as a means towards utopia, whether it's in Plato or Rousseau or in many utopias, always has the pretense of hiding within the claim of education a kind of coercion without force, a kind of dictatorship, or a kind of tyranny. And thus Arendt can say at the bottom of 173 that this kind of educational utopianism is principally the monopoly of revolutionary movements of a tyrannical caste. It's typically tyrannical revolutionary movements that want to take over education in order to reform society. For her, this is always a mistake. For education can play no part in politics, because in politics we always have to deal with those who are already educated. And this is a controversial, I think, and yet fundamental insight of Arendt's, which is that in politics we deal with adults. Adults have different opinions. And to say that we should educate people so that we will all have the same opinion is for her a kind of tyranny and an expression of a desire for tyranny. I say this a lot in my classes. A lot of my students sort of have the assumption, make the assumption, and express it, that if the media were just better and if we educated people better, we would all want what they want: healthcare, environmental rules, kind of different kind of educational system, etc. The assumption being that if we could just educate people right, we'd all agree. And again, those of you who've been in this group now for a while know that this is fundamentally not Arendt's viewpoint. She really does believe in plurality, and for her, the idea that education will lead to a kind of truth or a kind of conformity or homogeneity of opinion is a misunderstanding of human nature. And this is part of what is driving this. The last claim that she makes in this first part, there's 2 more claims that she makes, which is one that education has, in a sense, the crisis in education comes from a kind of crisis in common sense, and that this is part of what she considers to be the extraordinary success of progressive education, which in Europe existed here and there in small little moments, but was never widespread. Whereas in the United States, the success of progressive education, she sees as a part of the general loss of common sense. And then finally, this really fascinating discussion of equality on pages 176 to 177, where she says that it's the American demand for equality at a much higher and more vibrant level than in any other country, that also leads to this crisis of authority in education, because not only do we not have a meritocratic system where the best students get ahead, but we increasingly don't understand the teachers as having more knowledge or more authority than the students. And this demand for equality really does come at the cost of the teacher's authority and at the expense of the gifted among the students. And even though she says that, right, it's important to realize that she then says it's also equally obvious, at least to anyone who has come in contact with the American educational system, this is on 177, that this difficulty, namely the demand for equality in American education, has great advantages, not simply of a human kind, but educationally speaking as well. She doesn't really go into those further, and we can talk about what those great advantages of equality in education might be, but she really doesn't explore them. In any case, the second part of the book is about certain particular perplexities and problems that she sees with progressive education. And then the two core parts of the essay are sections 3 and 4. 3, where she asks, what is education? And her answer is that it is, on the one hand, natality. It's an attempt to rebirth the world through new people who enter it. And second, that it is conservative. It's about conserving a world. And that education is a balance between the need of a young person to live and the need of a young person to enter an already existing world. And a good educator and in a good educational system must balance those two needs of the student. And that this leads in the end to an understanding of education that preserves the newness of the world and of the new people in the world. It doesn't impose upon them a political agenda, and in so doing, it holds open the possibility for revolution and revolutionary action by the young against the world into which they come. And so her idea of education is in the end conservative and revolutionary, which is a fascinating combination. And then the final pages of the text are about the need to, in education, admit and also resist the claim of the crisis of authority. We can't deny it. It's there. And yet we have to somehow decide that in education, we need to preserve authority, even though that authority is somewhat artificial and is challenged and lost in the modern world. And that is for her the great challenge of modern education. Okay, there's a lot in the essay that's worth talking about. Some of it more general, theoretical about Arendt, and some of it really really more focused on education itself, and I will be guided by you. So let me see if I can get through, find some of these, if you have any questions. Someone asks in the, this is Suzanne Ouellette, what is happening in American education, as she writes, in the classroom with regard to policy in academic and professional studies of education? With whom is she arguing, supporting in this essay? So I mean, I think it's clear to some extent from the context that she's somewhat responding to a series um, uh, of two things. One is the emergence of progressive education, right? So we're 30 or 40 years after Dewey's work on education. Increasingly, the idea of progressive education is insinuating itself into the classroom. And in response to that, you are seeing a conservative response, a conservative uh, rejection of progressive education, saying we need to go back to reading, writing, and arithmetic. And so if you look in the footnotes, she cites a couple of these texts on both sides. And in part two, especially where she's talking about progressive education, she talks about the problem of Johnny can't read, and she's interested in the question of language education. Do we teach language by grammar or by immersion? And do we let students increasingly govern the classroom? So these are some of the questions she's asking. So to put it in the question of language education, uh, there was a movement, and I think it's still, if I understand it correctly, the dominant movement in language education in this country, certainly based on the way my children are being taught Spanish in school, is that you don't spend a whole lot of time learning grammar and learning the rules. You learn through speaking and singing songs and playing games and listening to music and watching movies. Um, and uh, and there's this sense that education should be a kind of fun, but it should be teaching through doing. And Arendt, in this essay, um, calls that a kind of infantilization of education. So this is on page 180 in section 2. On the top of 180, she talks about the obliterating as far as possible the distinction between play and work in favor of play. So that play was looked at as the liveliest and most appropriate way for the child to behave in the world. Only what can be learned through play does justice to this liveliness. Since the child's characteristic activity lies in play, learning in the old sense by forcing a child into an attitude of passivity compelled him to give his own playful initiative. We're seeing a return to this in a certain sense in internet education, where the idea is that children are supposed to educate themselves by using YouTube and Khan Academy and other online devices and pursue their own interests. And so this is one idea of this that Arendt is opposing. If you read further, she says that the same thing is for language, where students are supposed to learn through playing and doing, by speaking, that is, by doing and not by studying grammar and syntax. And if you look down to the bottom of this paragraph, she says, quite apart from the question of whether this is possible, namely whether you can learn language through simply speaking without grammar, it is perfectly clear that this procedure consciously attempts to keep the older child as far as possible at the infant level, the very thing that should prepare the child for the world of adults. The gradually acquired habit of work and of not playing is done away with in favor of the autonomy of the world of childhood. So, I mean, I think there's probably a lot of disagreement amongst us on the call here about whether play and learning by doing is an infantilization of education. Arendt thinks it is. It's treating learners as children. And while some learners are children, and it's probably appropriate at certain ages, to the extent it continues up into high school or college, she thinks that's a mistake. And where that ends and where we should make that shift is obviously an open question. But at some point, she thinks we have to start teaching the kids not just language, or not just the content, but how to do the work of learning, not simply through play. So, and by the way, there's a certain conservative response to that, Suzanne, that says it should just be reading, writing, and arithmetic, and we should just teach them the basics. And Arendt certainly doesn't believe that either. She's very clear that for her, education is an inculturation of being guided in. Educadere means to sort of lead one in. That's what education is, to a world, and that's a world of literature. It's a world of history, and for her, it's not just reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's the inculcation of a world and teaching them that the world is lovable. I mean, that's a strange formulation, but it comes from this idea of amor mundi that Arendt is here thinking a lot about at the time she writes this essay. And what she says here is that the students must be brought into the world as it exists. And to do that, the people who bring them in must love the world, and they must assume a responsibility for it. They can't simply be critics of it. And to the extent the teachers are critical of the world and think it's not just or not good, in a sense, they have to suppress that criticism for students. And they have to teach them to love the world, or at least teach them the world that the teachers love, or what's lovable in it. Let me stop there.
Roger?
Yeah, hi, Jack.
With reference to the learning of languages, people all over the world learn their languages initially, obviously, without grammar and syntax. They learn how to speak their language and how to understand it. And so it's one way to look at grammar and syntax is as an imposition of authority. That is to say, you learn the language on your own. Everybody learns the language on their own. And it's only when they go into the formal structure of a classroom or a school or whatever, where the teacher tells them, this is the way your language works. That's the imposition of authority. And in a world without authority, it's understandable why people would resist that.
Yeah, so let me just say that you always learn your first language, or the language that you're born into, through doing it, right? You learn not grammar. My first language is English. I didn't learn English through grammar. In fact, when I found that I had to learn grammar, I found it quite difficult. But if you are already, of a certain age, and I'm not sure exactly what that age is, but let's say 8, 10, 12, right? You're no longer, Arendt thinks there's two parts. One is you're no longer going to be able to learn a language that way, because to really learn a language that way, you have to be immersed in it. And you're now immersed in your first language. Unless you move to another country or you go to a complete immersion school, you're not going to learn the language the way you learn a first language. And so she thinks that simply from a practical matter, the way to do it is by teaching people the rules. The second part of that is that when you're studying a language, 3 times a week in Spanish class or in Russian class or in German class, and you're supposed to be learning songs and things, it's not because that's a better way to learn it for her. It's because the way of learning that we have has been infantilized. So yes, you learn you learn a language that you are born into and that you can be immersed in through immersion. But she's talking about learning language through study, and increasingly, for older people who are learning languages through study, they learn it not through grammar or through books or through being taught it, but by trying to do it. And it works somewhat, but it will rarely teach you how to speak that language well. It might, get you to the point where you can get around, but you're not going to learn the language well. and that's for her a practical as well as uh, um, a problematic authority issue. I think, so far as I understand it, the next question is from Jack again. Resolve the contradiction between the notion that immigrants need education in the language and how to be American with her notion that educating adults is brainwashing. Yes. Well, so educating adults is brainwashing simply means for her that if you attempt to educate people about politics, that is a kind of brainwashing. I mean, and by the way, that's not just for adults, that's for children too. One of the problems she has with this kind of politicized education for children is that it takes away their opportunity to rebel against the world. They're not learning the world as it is, they're learning the world as it should be. We're, in a sense, teaching them what they should do to change the world. I could give an example that's somewhat politically charged, I guess, but I mean, I live in New York City, and my children go to New York City schools, and they are being heavily educated towards a kind of sensitivity to language and to oppression that goes well beyond the common sense of certainly their grandparents and probably their parents. And there's a question about that's clearly how the educators at their schools have decided to make education serve what they call social justice. I just went to the 8th grade graduation at my kids' schools. Neither of them are in 8th grade, but I was there for other reasons. And every speech was about the need for these students to seek to further social justice. None of it was about economic social justice, right? None of it was about poor people or poverty. It was all about race and gender and transgenderism. And that is clearly the priority that the school has set for itself in imagining a social justice curriculum, which is a big part of the school's curriculum. I think from an Arendtian point of view, this is a brainwashing, whether it's done to adults or to children. Now, she does say that it is an important part of American education that, and by the way, I should say the opposite is true. If you teach people in school that there are only two genders or that one race is superior to another, that is another form of brainwashing. Arendt is clearly opposed to both. I'm just talking about the one that is currently in my world at play. She does think that immigrants need education in the language and how to be American. I don't think that's per se a contradiction. You're teaching people the language. I don't think that's at all a kind of brainwashing. That's but the second, how to be American, is more controversial, I think, and Jack brings up a good point. I think it's to be understood as you're teaching them the world that they are now going to come into, and part of the issue here is that in a world in which people stay where they are and they grow up, they learn about their world at home, right? And the school doesn't have to teach them about, if you're French and you grow up in France, in Paris, or in X or wherever, the school doesn't have to teach you what it means to be French. You learn that at home from your French parents and your French friends. But when you're an immigrant and you come to a new country, to a certain extent, at home you may still be living with parents from Europe or Central America or China or Korea. And part of what the school does is teach a kind of an American culture, which they probably aren't getting at home. So is this a kind of brainwashing? Yeah, I guess it is. And yet the American mythos, if you take it in such, is one of a country of immigrants, and that's part of it. So I think Arendt thinks that in order that there be a world that students are educated into, since there's so many different worlds that immigrants come from in the United States, the schools have to take some responsibility for attempting to articulate what that American world is. That may be a contradiction. I don't know how people see it. I think it's not exactly the same, because her claim is that there is a world that the schools are teaching, and they're not trying to teach people what America should be. They're trying to teach them what America is, the history of America, and its core values as it's emerged over time, which she would see as different from teaching what it should be. So I'll stop there and see if there's comments or questions on either of these. Yeah.
Roger, this is Howard. Hi, how are you?
Good, Howard.
A bunch of ideas here that, and I want to kind of yank this discussion forward in time, more towards where we are. It seems to me that, and I guess I'm talking about young adults and maybe adults, not maybe adults and adults. One of the problems is there's more than one world. There are many worlds, and it seems to me that part of the problem, and I'm not very familiar with what contemporary education does, so I may be totally off base here, but part of the problem is that we're still trying to teach a world, and I don't think any one particular teacher is capable of teaching more than one world, perhaps. And so when you get into education, I think you have to, from my perspective anyway, think in terms of a whole different structure of education, which would allow for people to articulate many views and to have a discussion of those views, with the idea not necessarily of brainwashing anyone to any point of view, but rather the idea of familiarizing people with listening to various views and forming their own opinions and being critical of what they hear, and eventually even being critical of what they think. So that's kind of where I am on this issue.
Thank you, Howard. I think that's an excellent point. So let's use that as an opportunity to look towards the end of the essay, which because you're raising, if I understand it, I'm going to rephrase it, but you're raising the question of authority, and isn't authority dead? And if authority is dead, isn't the attempt to educate a world somewhat coercive and brainwashing? And I think Arendt's answer is no, but here's how she tries to develop it. So look at page 191, the third to last page of the essay. And she says that the problem of education in the modern world lies in the fact that by its very nature, it cannot forgo either authority or tradition. So the problem is education needs authority, can't forgo it, and yet, continuing on, must proceed in a world that is neither structured by authority nor held together by tradition. We no longer have authority or tradition. What are we going to do in this kind of a situation? That means, however, that not just teachers and educators, but all of us, insofar as we live in one world, right? This is exactly your question, together with our children and with young people, must take toward them an attitude radically different from the one we take toward one another. This is an extraordinary claim. I mean, if we understand it. She's saying, Howard, when you and I talk, neither of us has authority over each other. And even when President Trump or President Obama talks to you or I, neither one of us has authority over one another. We no longer live in a world of public authority. But in the world of education, we have to take and treat and take consider our children and take an attitude radically different. We must, she continues, decisively divorce the realm of education from the others, most of all from the realm of public political life, in order to apply it alone a concept of authority and an attitude towards the past which are appropriate to it but have no general validity and must not claim a general validity in the world of grown-ups. In a sense, we need in the world of education to adopt an attitude of authority that doesn't exist in the public world, and that is to some extent no longer really true. There's a way in which we need to accept the fact that we have to embrace an attitude of authority that no longer exists. Now, that would, I think, suggest a kind of coercion or violence, because in a sense we're lying to our children. But the answer to that is given on 192, the page we started at, where she says that we can no longer go back to a world of authority. So she says near the top of the page, fellowship, that 10 lines down, fellowship and authority were in this case indeed but the two sides of the same matter, and the teacher's authority was firmly grounded in the encompassing authority of the past as such. Today, however, we are no longer in that position, and it makes little sense to act as though we still were, and had only, as it were, accidentally strayed from the bright path, and were free at any moment to find our way back to it. We can't just go back and say, well, we want to have authority again, so we're going to start teaching as if we had authority. What she says is we can't reverse the loss of authority. And so what she says is we need, in a sense, to educate and lead students into the world as it is. And what is the world as it is? It's the world in which authority has been lost. We have to teach them that world. That means we have to teach them the world that was the world of authority, and teach them the loss of authority. And that kind of reconciliation with the facts of the world, and teaching them that this loss of authority, which is comes from a kind of estrangement from the world, is part of the world they're growing up into. We have to teach them that world. But we also have to teach them that the power of human thought and action allows for them to interrupt and arrest that process of estrangement. What we shouldn't do, she's saying, is teach them how to do it. We shouldn't tell them how to interrupt that process of estrangement. We shouldn't teach them, we think you should be environmentalists, or we think you should be, arguing for poverty programs, or we think you should be arguing for gender equality, or we think you should be arguing for racial equality. We shouldn't be giving them the what we should do, but we should be confronting them head on with the crises of authority and the loss that crises and the danger that crises presages for them and our future. And that's, as I understand it, her response to this problem. Pat asks, how valid are criticisms 40 or 50 years ago for today? Um, is tradition a limiting concept, and what exactly does she mean by authority in education? I think I mean, we can have that discussion. I certainly think the problem of authority is still there today. Um, I think we've seen a vacillating back and forth between progressive trends in education and more conservative trends in education. Um, so that's still there. I don't think she would accept either of them per se. I think one thing she talks a lot about in this essay, I think she mentions it at least twice, and that is still very much alive today, is teacher training. She is not a fan of pedagogy as a way to train teachers. So, as many of you I'm sure know, in order to become a teacher in the in most states, you need to go to get a master's in teaching. And teaching colleges have largely taken the position that what you need to learn in order to be a teacher is how to teach, pedagogy. And Arendt has a different view, right? She thinks that what you actually learn, especially at slightly higher levels of let's call it high school, in order to teach is not pedagogy, but history or literature or math or science. And she thinks that a teacher should have authority that comes from knowing things, not authority that comes from having been taught how to teach. And this is still the case, I think, as a general rule in Masters of Education's program. There are a couple of exceptions, right? And I mean, for Bard College, I teach at Bard College, and Bard has become known for a Masters in Teaching program that specifically is Arendtian. I mean, it's not an accident. Our president of our college was a student of Arendt's, but it is specifically designed to teach teachers and give them a master's in a particular subject, be it literature, history, math, or science, and not in teaching. And so it's somewhat of an outlier in the pedagogy world. And I think there must be some others at this point that I don't know about because it's not my field. But this is a battle that Arendt has already identified 75 years ago, and as far as I can tell, is still largely being lost.
I think part of my confusion, Roger, is the fact she doesn't really break it down into what's appropriate for primary, secondary, and then college. Your comments obviously are for college and so on, but for the primary schools, are her criticisms more valid? For some people, if you're teaching young children, is the subject matter so that you need to have a master's or a doctorate in history to be teaching, second grade children. That's my point about that. The other thing, getting back to what you should be teaching, isn't the idea simply said you have to teach people to think at the higher, at your level, and the problem there, I would assume, is the move to science versus humanities. Isn't that the issue in terms of thinking and higher education? Thanks for your response, Roger.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, she doesn't make these distinctions. I mean, I'm not going to find it immediately because it's not a part that I've spent a lot of time on. But she does at one point speak about how in the United States we have, in a sense, confused primary and secondary education. If someone finds that passage, let me know where it is. But what she has in mind, of course, the difference between a primary education in Europe and then a gymnasium or a secondary school in which you really start learning a much more advanced curriculum, at the age of 15, 16, or 17, depending on what European country you're in. So she has a critique of American high schools or secondary education, which is that they have generally seen themselves as continuous with primary education as opposed to divided. And the reason for this is this belief in equality, right? So this is at the end of section 1 of the essay, but where she says that in a number of countries, when you move from primary school to secondary school, you have to take a test which sort of sorts people out between those who are going to move into more academic and advanced fields and those who are going to go into more vocational or other fields. And she says that in America we don't allow this because of our belief in equality and our opposition to meritocracy. But what this has the effect of doing is continuing the same style of primary education all the way up through high school. And I think that's generally accurate. I think our high schools in this country are in crisis. One of my views is that a lot of the problems that we are suffering on the college level right now are coming from the fact that our high schools are not doing their jobs. High schools are a great resource in this country. They're paid for by the government. Everyone can get a free high school education in this country. And if high schools were good, I mean, just think about what that would mean for the educational level of the country. The problem is that we spend so much time and money now on college education and trying to make college accessible for everyone, much of which people take loans for and have to get in debt to do and is not free. And a lot of what they're learning in college is remedial because they haven't learned it in high school and because the high schools aren't good enough. If we took the money we were spending on public remedial college level education and sunk it into making high school education, which everyone takes and is free, really good, that would do a lot more for the country, I think, in its educational level than our current system. But in any case, one of the problems we have in high school right now is that, except for private high schools, which are in many ways a problem because you take the people who can afford it or the people who really have educational ambition and you take them out of the public system, the public high schools are really not yet serious college level academic training, and people have already learned reading, writing, arithmetic. And Arendt certainly thought, and I think many people still think today, that for many people in high school, it's largely a waste of time. They're not getting they've already gotten enough for the primary, and they're not being challenged enough with a real education. And so I do think that's important. Again, I hate to I'm not trying to plug Bard in any ridiculous way, but President Botstein and Bard, Leon Botstein, who again was an Arendt student, largely with this in mind, wrote a book called Jefferson's Children many years ago, arguing that the American system of high school was a waste and was not being used properly, and has developed a whole series of early colleges, Bard High School early colleges around the country, which are designed to use the 4 years of high school to, in a sense, give people a college education for free, because these are all public schools. And the idea is to accelerate the process. And it's been an enormously successful project, and we're opening new schools every year. But to me, this is the kind of reform that we need now in high school, right, and not in primary school. But I would put it in that area.
Roger, when I one of the first jobs that I had after graduating from college was to go to work for an organization that did curriculum development. And this organization was initially founded by professors at Harvard, physics professors at Harvard and MIT, who were tired of doing remedial physics at the college level and tried to design a curriculum for the high schools where they would learn contemporary physics, if I may. But the obstacle to that, then and now, is exactly this conservatism that Arendt calls for, because what prevented the youth of that time, I don't know about today, but prevented the youth of that time from learning very elementary 20th century physics was that their teachers had all been educated in 19th century physics, and they were reluctant to let it go, or they found 20th century physics too difficult because they had already achieved careers as teachers. So this is I don't know how the Bard high schools work. I'm confident that they work as well as you say, because I'm also a product of Bard College, so I can understand it. But I think that from that experience, I learned a great deal about what was going on in the schools.
Yeah,
and it was also a political component, which
Jack,
I'll talk about another time.
Let me say that. I mean, this is one of the reasons that in colleges across the country we do something that is considered very controversial for many taxpayers, which is that we ask professors to publish as well as to teach. And people say, why do you do that? They should just teach. We're paying them. Why should they be spending time on their own career? And the answer to that is that, and this doesn't always, of course, work out, but the hope is that by publishing, they're continuing to think and stay current in their discipline, and continuing to learn the new innovations, the new thoughts, the new thinking of their discipline. And so by creating high school teachers who are trained in physics and not trained in pedagogy, the claim is that these are people who will actually be interested in physics and keep up with the discipline. At Bard, the teachers not only have masters, they also have PhDs, the Bard early colleges. And as a result, they're people who have a disciplinary identity and continue to publish. Most of them do. So the idea is to try and create a faculty that is not simply going to stay in one place, but will keep up with the learning of the discipline. So I think it's an important point, and it is one of the reasons it's important to publish. I mean, I think a lot of people publish too much, not because they're actually publishing learning, just because they want things on their CV. That's a different point of view. But it is important for faculty to continue to engage in research and publishing, because it's what keeps them current in their discipline. Yeah.
I think another part of the problem is this idea of a fixed curriculum that everybody has to be exposed to in a particular sequence, particularly in the age group that we're talking about, middle school through high school. People mature and people develop at different rates, not necessarily based upon their age. So you can have two people of the same age group, but their ability to learn and to grapple with with the complexity of issues, it can be vastly different. And it doesn't mean that one is necessarily smarter than the other, because the other one may catch up a couple of years later.
Yeah.
So we have this inflexibility kind of built into the system, and my personal, I'm not an expert in education, is that it's money based. It's the idea of, well, that would be very expensive if we were going to do that, and that comes down to the values as to how important is education to our society.
Yeah, I think that's fair, Howard. I mean, I think there is no doubt that people learn in different ways, right? Just as there's a plurality of people with different political and other viewpoints, there's a plurality of ways that people learn. Some people are visual learners, some people are silent learners, some people like to learn by reading or doing, some people learn by studying, some people study alone, some people study with others. really, I mean, in my experience as a teacher and as a parent and as a human being, I study, a lot of other things. I study martial arts. I study things. I've seen that people learn in different ways. Some people want to have it explained to them. Some people just want to copy it. And uh, uh, any teacher who says, I'm going to teach this way and everyone has to learn this way is going to fail a lot of their students. I mean, it's not going to be good for a lot of their students. A good teacher, in my experience, is somebody who's adept at explaining the same thing in many different ways, through example, through analysis, through specifics, and through generalities. And there's no one way to do it. And so anytime I meet a teacher who says to me, I teach through phonics, I know they're a terrible teacher. But just like if someone says to me, I only teach through, reading and they have to read it and there's no phonics, I know they're a terrible teacher, right? The good teachers are the ones who are able to incorporate, in my experience, lots of different modalities. Then they're not ideological in their approach to teaching. Just as when my wife and I were about to have a child, people would say, what's your parenting philosophy? And I said, I have no idea, but I got people telling me you have to do this, co-sleeping, or you have to do this, let them cry it out. And I said, well, I figure we'll try a lot of different things. I don't know. I mean, I've always been suspicious of people who thought they had the answer to any particular approach. And part of this is just, there are good teachers and bad teachers. Today, we want to make everyone a good teacher through having them follow some formula. I don't think that works. And there's a certain kind of artistry to good teaching that, in all honesty, if it can be taught, it's not going to be taught through sitting in a classroom of being told how to do it. It's going to be taught through having experienced good teaching, right? To the extent I'm a good teacher, it's because I had good teachers and I've modeled myself on them. It's not because anyone ever sat down. I have never taken a course in how to teach. And I don't see any value in such a thing. That's my own personal view. I think that a good teacher is someone who can, to use an example, read a text and try and analyze it word by word, but also give examples and answer questions and try and use different ways of trying to make people who are their students somehow see what this text is trying to do. That's just one example. And not to just, there are people who will get up in front of a class and lecture and nothing else. And there are people who will only get up in front of a class and answer questions and give no lecture because they believe lecturing is bad. Well, lecturing has its use. Some students will get a lot out of lecturing, right? But if you only lecture, I think that's a limitation. Suzanne asks, seems to me Arendt is encouraging a kind of education that takes a very long time. How does this happen in our world in which so much seems to need to happen so fast, in which there's an extraordinary mobility? How do we educate children who are on the move? To me, this is not just about children, but it's one of the biggest questions of our time. I mean, it's impacting all of us. And I will tell you that, as 2 and 3 year olds are on iPads and iPhones and whatever you call them, and 6 and 7 year olds have email accounts and 10 year olds have cell phones. I don't know the answer to this. I mean, I look at it this way. I grew up without these kind of distractions. Now, I mean, I'm not that old. I still had TVs. But, if I sat down to read a book, I read a book. There wasn't something beeping at me constantly. And even having trained myself for 4 decades in how to focus on a book and growing up reading a book as an activity that I am good at, I have an enormous difficulty today reading a book for a sustained amount of time. I I need to leave my phone behind if I want to actually get reading done. I need to leave the computer behind and the phone behind. And if I hadn't grown up with that experience, I'm not sure I would know enough to know what I was missing in not being able to read a book. So how are these students who grow up never being separated from a phone or a device going to learn the art of sustained attention? I don't know. And I mean, this is, this is where, I look at myself and start slapping myself and say, don't sound like an old fogey, right? I don't want to. But there's a part of me that thinks that students, young people, need to be protected from this. Arendt talks in section 3, I believe, about privacy and the distinction between life and world. I think in a certain way, it is absolutely necessary to protect students as long as possible from the world. And that means from their connection to the internet and to email and to whatever it is, Facebook or whatever it is we're talking about. It seems to me that parents and teachers have abandoned that effort and that responsibility. And as a parent, I know how hard that is. My students, my children cry and cry for all of it. And yet, it seems to me that this is an absolute existential question for our children. Because if they grow up connected to the world at this age already, at this time, I don't see how they can develop an independent personality. I don't see how they can develop an independent sense of judgment that's not connected to their chatting groups or their hive minds on Facebook. Sherry Turkle, who's a wonderful scholar of this phenomena at MIT, who studies technology in children, has written a number of books on this issue. And she basically has come to the conclusion that when these young people spend so much time texting and interacting with each other on social media, they actually lose the ability to make independent judgments. Because the way they start, whenever something happens, they start texting before they think what they think, and they develop what they think in collaboration with their friend group, their peer group. And this is a radical transformation in the nature of what it means to be an adult. Now, I will tell you, there's some people in Silicon Valley who say this is good. It's called, teamwork and collaborative adulthood or collaborative learning environments, and that we should embrace the fact that we now have, through technology, the ability to, in a sense, make decisions in a kind of collaborative work environment. This is, I think, a fascinating question, and this is one of those things where I think we, as a civilization, are heading towards that change in the nature of what it means to be an independent human being. And we have to think about, do we want to go down that road? This is what Hannah Arendt means with the question, we need to think what we are doing. We are doing this. And one of the questions, Suzanne, that Arendt is forcing us to ask ourselves, I hope, in an essay like this is, should we let schools and childhood simply enter into the world of speed and collectivity, or should we in some sense artificially put up barriers protecting them from that, which will be painful because the kids will want to be in that world and they will scream and cry and they will rebel. And what she's saying is we should put up artificial barriers and assume a responsibility for our world. And if they get older and they want to overthrow our world and revolutionize it, that's their choice as adults. But we should at least embrace our world enough to present it to them and let them make that decision. And I think most of us as parents, and I mean, look, this is an eternal struggle. I'm not blaming anybody. And as teachers are not living up to our responsibility in this regard. I think it's an incredibly challenging time to raise kids as both a parent and an educator today.
Roger, I have a question. The question is what you're talking about our world, in the sense that our generation, I'm a young guy, so
I know,
my world, is what it is. But the world that fits the calendar that's on the table behind me, it's a very different world. And so I think, as I read the essay, there's this tension between the two worlds. And I don't think that you can simply ignore that. The kids have the cell phone in their pocket. I remember going to a lecture, and the person who was delivering the lecture making a comment that her daughter could send a text with the phone in her pocket.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's the real world.
Yeah.
And so how do we, obviously we have to do both, but the real difficult part,
you can't
figuring out what that is.
You can't deny that cell phones are there. But you can do a couple things. One, you can decide whether to allow cell phones in the classroom. I mean, I've given lectures at a couple of colleges in the last 4 or 5 years where every student in the classroom had their cell phone out texting during the lecture. And I was in shock. And afterwards, the faculty came up to me and said, it was a great lecture. Our students were texting less than they usually do in class. And I couldn't believe that this is the way college students sat through class. Well, I mean, a student in my class who takes their cell phone out is asked to leave and fails the class. I mean, so this is not denying that cell phones exist. It's just saying, look, we're in a classroom and that's not part of it. Now, granted, that will make me unpopular with some of my students, but, I'm making a claim. At the same point, one of the things we have to do as teachers is be aware of this tension that you rightly point to and say, look, here's why I'm not letting you sit on a cell phone in class. And here's the tension that is now our world. And you are going to have to decide, after 4 years of being pounded into submission by me, whether when you get out, you want to then say, I want only cell phones, I don't want to read books, or you're going to say, you know what, something Berkowitz said made an impact on me, and I'm going to make time in my life to read without interruption. Right? Okay. That's a choice you'll have to make. But that, to me, is what we need to be doing as teachers. Forcing that choice on the students.
Roger, watch out that you're not caught up in nostalgia for the book, because McLuhan predicted all of this a long time ago. He was very clear about what happens to the book in this age, and the revolution. The problem is that the revolution has already occurred, unfortunately, without consciousness. And I think the real problem is not that the revolution has occurred, but that we live in this revolutionary time where the purpose of the revolution and its function in the society has not been thought through, and is not a question of individual will, but not the thing itself, because it really is possible to learn off the computer to read off if you like, to read images, to read collectively and collaboratively. All of that is possible. Yeah. Only meaningful if it's deliberate.
Yeah, no doubt, Jack. I have a Kindle suddenly. My wife gave me one recently, and it's been a revelation, because the Kindle is not doesn't have internet, doesn't have email, doesn't even have a clock on it when you're reading. And I have in the last couple of months realized that I get more reading done on a Kindle than I do on a book if I have my phone out next to me. The point is not the medium. The point is that there is a value in long form engagement with texts, or it could be movies or video or whatever, that is uninterrupted and thoughtful. I'm not suggesting that we can't and by the way, interestingly enough, in the last year, ebook sales are down and paper book sales are up. It's not clear whether ebooks are winning. To me, the worst indication of what's happening today is amongst my scholar friends, right? Who I see all the time citing these incredible, quotes that they found. And then when I ask them about it, they say, yeah, I Googled it. And they found the quote. It's like if you were to read Hannah Arendt, not by reading her text, but when you want to know what Hannah Arendt says about freedom, you Google Hannah Arendt and freedom, and you find some quotes and you use one. And this is how so much of scholarship is being done today. But it's completely decontextualizing the quotation from the book. I mean, people want to read On Revolution or The Human Condition online or on a PDF because they want to search for the quotes. Well, the advantage to my mind of having a book with notes in it that I know, and I remember that was on the right-hand facing page or on the left-hand facing page, is that you read a book and you get the entire argument and you get the context. And today, this idea of there's no books, there's one giant book on the internet with words and you can just find the quotes you want. That to me is the real danger. And I hope we'll avoid it. Let me move on because I've got a couple questions left and we have a bunch of time, not much time. Daphne writes on page 179, she talks about the teacher today as one expected to be able to teach anything, which does not involve mastery of anything. Would not mastery of a subject automatically create authority? Her argument is that mastery of a subject might create authority and should, and that your authority should come from mastery of a subject, not mastery of pedagogical techniques, right? If I understand your question correctly. So she says not only that the students are actually left to their own resources, but that the most legitimate source of the teacher's authority as the person who, turn it whatever way one will, still knows more and can do more than oneself, is no longer effective. That's the problem that happens when teachers no longer know their subject. So yes, she wants the teachers to know their subject. I'm not sure if I understood your question, but I hope that's a good answer, Daphne. If you want to follow up, you can. Bob writes, I'm not sure about the relevance of formality to authority, but having just returned from a local funeral in our rural area, I'm sorry, Bob, I am struck once again how informal public appearance has become. Yes. People have been dressing down for years, funerals notwithstanding. In our family, bank staff loves jeans Friday, flip-flops not allowed. Is this a manifestation, as Arendt might have it, of the significance of appearance for the realization of being? Is this a case being the chipping away of authority? Yeah, these are important questions. So there's no doubt that the deformalization or the informalization of public appearance is part and parcel of the loss of authority. I don't think it's only that. I think there's been there's a lot of fascinating work on this. I mean, one aspect of it is uh, an American drive for equality, so that people don't want to be seen as wealthy or upper class, and so there's a desire for appearing as just one of the guys, even though your jeans are $500 jeans and your flip flops are $2,000 flip flops. You know, that's a big part of the sort of dress down phenomena. The schlumpy suit as well. But yeah, I think that, and I think there's another side of it is that people want that there's an idea that you want your genius to be authentic, not a matter of presentation. So that you want to, people, you know, I know when I was in college, and this is a while ago, but I don't think it's changed that much. Everyone always said, I didn't do the work, I didn't do the reading, I didn't study, and then, you know, got an A on the exam. And you're like, how did they do that? There was the desire that everyone wanted to imagine themselves or present themselves as the genius who didn't have to do the work, but could get the A anyway. And I think that's a deep, I think it's a deep part of certain segments of the population. It's not the rhetorical self-presentation of the striver who comes from a lower class who takes great pride in working hard, but it is a part of the self-presentation of the sort of privileged people who do well but want to present themselves as just having a genius behind them. But you know, your question is deep on a lot of levels, Bob, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do it justice here. But you basically ask, is this a manifestation of the significance of appearance for the realization of being? And the being the chipping away of authority. Yeah, I think that's actually a really nice, you know, way to put it. I'm not going to say I've thought this through 100%, but insofar as we live in a world without authority and without traditions, in a sense, to dress up, to wear a tie, to look sharp, is seen as fake, a kind of searching for an authority that doesn't exist. Whereas coming across as more authentic and down to earth is seen as a more truthful representation of who we are. I think that's a fair way to put it. But I haven't thought this through 100%. So if anyone wants to add anything, I'm open to that. I'm not sure I have a full answer to Bob's question. Just to follow up with Daphne's earlier question, she has a follow up. Could whether the problem of the loss of authority could be resolved by the replacing teach anything and replacing with mastery subjects? The answer is no. It can't be resolved because authority has been lost, and yet it can help in this project that I've sort of focused on of creating an artificial barrier between the world of the child that has authority and the public world. And I think that is what Arendt is trying to do. And so there are two ways to create that barrier. One is by teaching people how to teach, and the other is by teaching them their subjects. And she certainly believes in the latter. Pat asks, combining Howard's point regarding the basic curriculum and your thoughts on the distractions are dealing with, it's a fact that education changed to handle the real world. You sound like you're fighting it. Reading will never die. You know, I do fight it and I don't fight it. I mean, I still assign books. I know at another school that I used to teach at when I went to Amherst College, at least the majority of classes in political science that are taught there, as far as I know, don't use books anymore. They use readers, which are excerpts of books. And this is more and more common around the country. Instead of assigning books, people take the relevant pages or chapters from the book and create a reader and sort of have people read, those pages. I do that in one course I teach for particular reasons, but I'm still generally someone who believes it's important to teach books and have students read whole books. And I hate edited books. I hate condensed books. I think, I remember a couple of years ago, Walter Russell Mead and I ran a series of public lectures with people on blogging and the new public intellectual. And we had a couple of younger bloggers come in, and one of the questions we talked to them about is, how do you blog when you've never written books? And they said, well, why is that even a problem? I mean, blogging is short opinion. And my view is, well, I've done some blogging, and it strikes me that what blogging is at its best is when you've written books and written long forms and read a lot of books, you take very long and complicated ideas and you figure out how to shorten them and put them in a somewhat shorter, more pointed way. Today people think, oh, you don't need that first step. You just have to have the short opinions. To me, blogging is taking a big iceberg under the surface of knowledge and figuring out what the point is that attaches to this particular incident. And too often today, opinion is divorced of that iceberg, just floating in the ocean. I don't know if Pat's saying books will exist or not. I don't know. I mean, I hope they do. I think all of us in education are palpably aware of how difficult it is for students to finish books today. There's no doubt this is different than it was even 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I mean, I have to remind myself, when I first came to Bard 10, 12 years ago, most of my students did not have cell phones walking around the campus. I mean, we forget how fast this has changed. They did not have cell phones walking around the campus. A couple did, but most did not. Now, of course, everybody has one. That changes their lives, and there's no doubt that they have more trouble reading today a whole book than they did 10 or 12 years ago. Suzanne asks, are barriers the same as banisters? Suzanne, what barriers being what? Remind me. Can you come on and tell me? Barriers. I must have said barriers, but I don't remember the context I said it in. Barriers to. Does anyone know what the reference is here? Okay. I think we'll end it there. This is a fun essay. It's actually one of my favorite essays of Arendt because it gets us into some really controversial contemporary themes. Excellent. Thanks very much, guys.